Staff Sergeant Kiara, Phoenix Delacroix, had perfected the art of being invisible. For 9 months at Combat Outpost Viper in Somalia's unforgiving highlands, she'd managed communications, coordinated supply runs, and maintained radio silence while the desert sun turned the Marib Governorate into a furnace that hit 130 degrees by midday. What her fellow soldiers didn't know was that when the legendary Sergeant Major Blake Ghost Sullivan's hands started shaking during training, when his legendary precision crumbled under the weight of trauma, she would be the one to make the most impossible shot in military history, a 4-mile kill shot that would save an entire operation and reveal a secret she'd buried for 3 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The other soldiers at Combat Outpost Viper knew Kiara as the soft-spoken communications specialist who could fix any radio malfunction and never complained about the conditions that made hardened warriors question their life choices. She typed reports faster than anyone else, coordinated supply drops with machine-like efficiency, and had an uncanny ability to predict when the satellite uplink would go down during sandstorms. What they didn't notice was why she unconsciously calculated wind patterns every morning, letting grains of sand slip through her fingers while her eyes tracked the horizon with the focused intensity of a predator scanning for prey. They didn't see how her weathered hands, calloused in specific patterns, bore the telltale marks of someone who'd spent thousands of hours with a rifle stock pressed into the same spot on her shoulder. Most importantly, they had no idea why she sometimes woke in the middle of the night, her body automatically assuming a prone shooting position before she caught herself and pretended it was just another nightmare about the desert heat. Captain Garrett Thorne made no secret of his opinion about support personnel at Combat Outpost Viper. 6 feet of military bearing and West Point arrogance, built like the football player he'd been before trading touchdowns for tactical operations, Thorne represented everything modern military leadership promised to be: decisive, confident, and utterly convinced of his own superiority. He'd announced during yesterday's morning briefing, loud enough for everyone in the command bunker to hear, "Communications specialists are necessary overhead, but let's not pretend they're operators. Some people coordinate missions, others execute them." The words had cut deeper than Thorne intended, not because they hurt Kiara's feelings, but because they reminded her of another life, another identity she deliberately buried beneath radio frequencies and supply manifests. She'd perfected her invisibility so thoroughly that even she sometimes forgot who she used to be before the nightmares, before the guilt, before she'd begged for the most remote, forgettable assignment the military could offer. Corporal Mason Torres, 21 and fresh from his second deployment, was one of the few soldiers who treated her with genuine respect. Maybe it was because he was young enough to see people as individuals rather than job classifications. Or maybe he genuinely recognized her competence in ways that others overlooked. Either way, when he'd asked her yesterday why she always seemed to be listening to something nobody else could hear, she'd almost told him the truth about her past. Almost. Instead, she smiled and said the desert played tricks on everyone's hearing. It wasn't technically a lie. The desert did create auditory illusions, shifting sounds and distances until reality became fluid. But Kiara's ears had been trained to hear things that others missed entirely. The distinctive crack of different rifle calibers, the whistle of incoming mortar rounds, the specific engine notes that meant trouble was approaching fast and low over the horizon. 9 months of pretending to be nobody special, and she could still calculate ballistic trajectories in her sleep with mathematical precision that had once made her legendary. The morning routine at Combat Outpost Viper followed the same pattern it had for months. Intelligence reports arrived through encrypted channels, suggesting possible insurgent movement in the surrounding mountains. The base received these reports constantly, situated as it was in the heart of territory where warlords and extremist groups fought for control of ancient smuggling routes. The outpost housed 47 souls who understood they were essentially sitting targets, protected by little more than concrete barriers and the reputation of their legendary sniper. Sergeant Major Blake Ghost Sullivan had once been the most feared marksman in Special Operations Command. His record spoke for itself. 127 confirmed kills, multiple records for long-distance precision shooting, and a reputation that made enemy combatants think twice about operating in his area of influence. For 2 years, his presence at Combat Outpost Viper had been their primary deterrent against large-scale attacks. Insurgents knew that showing themselves within his effective range was essentially suicide. But something had changed in Blake Sullivan over the past 3 months. Something that started as minor inconsistencies during training exercises had grown into a crisis that threatened not just his career, but the safety of everyone under his protection. Kiara had been one of the first to notice the subtle signs. The way his hands trembled slightly when he thought no one was watching, the beads of sweat that appeared on his forehead during routine weapon maintenance, the increasing frequency of his visits to the base medical officer for sleep aids and anxiety medication. She'd observed from her position in the communications bunker as Blake's legendary precision began to deteriorate. Shots that should have been automatic started missing their marks by inches, then feet. His breathing patterns during shooting exercises became irregular, his stance less confident. Most telling of all was the way he'd begun making excuses to avoid the daily marksmanship training that had once been his obsession. The other soldiers either hadn't noticed or chose to ignore the signs. Blake's reputation was too powerful, too essential to their sense of security, for anyone to acknowledge that their guardian angel might be losing his wings. But Kiara saw everything from her supposedly invisible position managing communications and logistics. She watched him struggle with equipment that had once been extensions of his own body, witnessed the private moments when his legendary composure cracked under the weight of whatever demons had taken up residence in his mind. During her evening radio checks, she'd often seen Blake on the observation deck, staring out at the desert through his spotting scope. But instead of the confident surveillance of a master sniper, his movements were hesitant, uncertain. Sometimes his hands shook so badly that he had to put down the optics entirely, pretending to clean the lenses while he waited for the tremors to pass. The irony wasn't lost on Kiara that she, the supposedly invisible support staff, was probably the only person at Combat Outpost Viper who truly understood what Blake Sullivan was experiencing. She'd seen it before, in mirrors and in the eyes of other operators who'd pushed themselves beyond human limitations until something inside them snapped like an overstressed cable. She knew the signs because she'd lived through them herself, 3 years ago, in circumstances that had forced her to make a choice between continuing as the operator she'd trained to become or disappearing entirely into the anonymous safety of support roles. The difference was that Blake's breakdown was happening in slow motion, visible to anyone who knew what to look for, while her own was swift and decisive, a single moment of clarity that had shown her exactly how much the warrior's life had cost her. As she filed her evening communications report, her fingers automatically moved across the keyboard while her mind processed the subtle changes in Blake's behavior patterns. Tomorrow would bring new intelligence briefings, new potential threats, new situations that might require the kind of precision shooting that once made Blake Sullivan a legend. But watching him struggle with basic marksmanship exercises, seeing the doubt and fear that had replaced his legendary confidence, she wondered how much longer their protection would last. The desert night settled over Combat Outpost Viper with the sudden finality of a curtain dropping. In the communications bunker, Kiara continued her work, monitoring radio frequencies and satellite feeds, while 46 other souls slept under the protection of a guardian whose hands had begun to shake. None of them knew that their invisible communication specialist had once been something far more dangerous than their legendary sniper had ever dreamed of becoming. And none of them could have imagined that within days, when Blake Sullivan's nerve finally shattered completely, it would be their overlooked support staff who would attempt the most impossible shot in military history. A shot that would either save them all or reveal just how far some warriors will fall when the weight of violence finally breaks them. The first sign that Sergeant Major Blake Ghost Sullivan was losing his legendary touch came during a routine training exercise on a Tuesday morning when the temperature was already climbing toward its daily peak of unbearable. Master Sergeant Antonio Reeves had set up targets at 800 meters, child's play for someone with Blake's reputation. For 2 years, Blake had been putting rounds through playing cards at that distance, making shots that other snipers would call impossible, while barely breaking a sweat. But that morning, his first shot missed the target entirely, sailing high and to the right by nearly 2 feet. The gathered soldiers exchanged glances, assuming it was a scope malfunction or ammunition irregularity. Even legends had off days, they told themselves. Blake himself forced a laugh, made a joke about desert mirages playing tricks on his eyes, and cycled the bolt for his second attempt. The second shot missed by even more. By the fourth consecutive miss, the laughter had died completely. Blake's hands were visibly trembling as he tried to steady the rifle, sweat beading on his forehead despite the early morning hour. His breathing had become irregular, the controlled respiratory patterns that had made him famous replaced by shallow, rapid gasps that spoke of barely controlled panic. "Equipment malfunction," he announced to the assembled soldiers, his voice carrying a forced confidence that didn't match the fear in his eyes. "Rifle needs to go to the armorer for recalibration." But everyone present knew that Blake Sullivan maintained his own weapons with obsessive precision. If there was a malfunction, it wasn't mechanical. From her position near the communications equipment, ostensibly there to coordinate training schedules and range safety protocols, Kiara had watched the entire scene unfold with growing recognition. She'd seen these symptoms before, in mirrors and in the faces of other operators who'd been pushed beyond human limitations until something fundamental inside them broke. The 1,000-yard stare that replaced focused intensity, the way hands that had once been steady as granite began to shake like leaves in a windstorm, the retreat from the very skills that had defined their entire identity. Blake Sullivan was experiencing what military psychiatrists clinically termed combat stress reaction, but what operators themselves called the shake, a psychological condition where the mind's survival mechanisms finally rebelled against the constant exposure to life and death precision. It was the warrior's equivalent of a surgeon suddenly being unable to hold a scalpel steady, a condition that could end careers and, in combat zones, get people killed. The official military response to such breakdowns was typically swift and bureaucratic: medical evaluation, psychological counseling, and often immediate removal from active duty. But Blake's reputation was so essential to Combat Outpost Viper's operational effectiveness that acknowledging his condition would have been tantamount to admitting their primary defensive advantage had evaporated. Captain Thorne, Master Sergeant Reeves, and the other leadership seemed determined to ignore the obvious rather than face the implications. Over the following weeks, Kiara observed Blake's deterioration with the clinical detachment of someone who understood exactly what was happening. His daily routine, once rigidly disciplined, began showing cracks. He started avoiding the weapons cleaning sessions that had been his meditation, claiming administrative duties required his attention. His meals became irregular, appetite suppressed by whatever medication the base medical officer had prescribed for his increasingly obvious anxiety. Most telling was the way he'd begun to flinch at unexpected sounds. The slam of a door would make him jump. The crack of a flagpole rope against its metal post in the wind would cause his head to snap around with the hyper-vigilant alertness of someone expecting incoming fire. These weren't the reactions of a confident predator. They were the responses of prey. The breaking point had occurred 3 months earlier during what should have been a routine overwatch mission in the hills overlooking a suspected insurgent supply route. Intelligence had indicated possible weapons movement through the area, and Blake had been positioned with his spotter, Corporal Danny Kim, to provide surveillance and interdiction if necessary. According to the after-action report that Kiara's had access to through her communications role, the mission had proceeded normally for the first 6 hours. Blake and Kim had established their hide site, conducted surveillance, and reported negative contact throughout the day. But as afternoon shadows began lengthening across the valley, everything had changed. A single insurgent had appeared on the ridgeline opposite their position, approximately 1,200 meters away. The target had been moving with the casual confidence of someone who believed himself unobserved, carrying what appeared to be a communications device, potentially coordinating the very supply movement that they'd been tasked to interdict. Blake had acquired the target, calculated the shot, and prepared to engage. It should have been routine, textbook precision shooting for someone of his caliber. But as his finger found the trigger, as he began the steady rearward pressure that would send a .338 Lupua Magnum round across more than a kilometer of desert air, something inside him had simply refused to function. Later, Kim would describe watching Blake's hands begin to shake so violently that he couldn't maintain his sight picture. His breathing became rapid and shallow. His face went pale, and sweat began pouring down his forehead despite the cool mountain air. Instead of the controlled violence of a precision shot, Blake had frozen completely, his body betraying him at the moment when his skills were most needed. The insurgent had disappeared back into the rocks. The supply movement had proceeded undetected, and Blake Sullivan had experienced his first complete failure as an operator. But more than just a missed opportunity, it had been the moment when his legendary confidence shattered like glass under pressure. Kim, loyal to his sniper partner, had filed a report citing equipment malfunction and target loss to terrain masking. But Blake knew the truth, and more importantly, his subconscious mind had learned a lesson that would prove impossible to unlearn. In the moment when violence was required, his body had refused to cooperate. From that day forward, every time Blake picked up his rifle, every time he settled into a shooting position, every time he placed his eye to a scope, his nervous system remembered that moment of failure and responded with increasing panic. The shaking hands were just the visible symptom of a deeper psychological wound, the warrior's equivalent of a fatal system error. Kiara had recognized the signs because she had experienced her own version of the same breakdown 3 years earlier, under circumstances that had ultimately led her to abandon her operational career entirely. But where her response had been to disappear into support roles, Blake was trapped by his reputation and the expectations of everyone around him. He couldn't simply fade into anonymity. Too many people depended on his legendary abilities. She'd watched him struggle through training sessions that became increasingly painful to witness. His shot groups, once measured in fractions of inches, began spreading to hand-sized patterns, then dinner plate-sized patterns, then missing targets entirely. His confidence eroded with each failed attempt, creating a downward spiral where fear of failure guaranteed failure, which fed more fear. The medical officer, Lieutenant Dr. Sarah Martinez, had prescribed increasingly strong anti-anxiety medications, but pharmaceutical solutions couldn't address the fundamental problem. Blake's mind had learned to associate precision shooting with mortal terror, and no amount of chemical intervention could overcome that psychological conditioning. Captain Thorne's response had been predictably bureaucratic. Ignore the problem and hope it resolved itself. He'd canceled several scheduled training exercises, claimed that Blake was being rested for upcoming operations, and generally did everything possible to avoid acknowledging that their primary defensive asset was crumbling before their eyes. But Kiara knew that avoidance wasn't going to solve Blake Sullivan's crisis. In fact, she suspected that their carefully maintained denial was about to collide with reality in the most dangerous way possible. The intelligence reports she processed daily suggested increasing insurgent activity in their area of operations. Satellite imagery showed suspicious movement patterns that indicated planning for a significant operation. Most concerning were the intercepted communications mentioning the American sniper, and discussions about removing the threat that had kept major insurgent operations away from their sector. Blake's reputation was both their greatest protection and their greatest vulnerability. If enemy forces discovered that the legendary Ghost had lost his nerve, Combat Outpost Viper would become a much more attractive target. As she compiled her evening intelligence summary, her fingers moved across the keyboard while her mind processed the growing crisis. Blake Sullivan needed help that went beyond medication and denial. He needed someone who understood exactly what he was experiencing, someone who could either help him recover his abilities
or step into the role he could no longer fill. The desert night settled over Combat Outpost Viper, with its familiar silence, broken only by the distant howl of wind through the rocky highlands. In his quarters, Blake Sullivan lay awake staring at the ceiling, his hands still trembling slightly as he relived another day of failed training exercises and disappointed expectations. Neither he nor anyone else at the outpost could have known that their communications specialist was lying in her own bunk, staring at her own ceiling, calculating wind patterns and bullet trajectories with the automatic precision of someone whose legendary abilities had never really disappeared. They'd simply been buried under 3 years of careful anonymity and deliberate mediocrity.
The emergency briefing was called for 0600 hours on a Wednesday morning, when the desert air still held traces of nighttime coolness that would be nothing but memory within 2 hours. Captain Thorne's voice over the base intercom carried an urgency that made everyone at Combat Outpost Viper understand that their routine morning was about to become anything but routine. All senior personnel and essential support staff report to the command bunker immediately. This is not a drill. Kiara arrived at the briefing room carrying her standard communications equipment and notepad, maintaining the careful facade of the invisible support specialist, while her trained mind automatically began processing the tension in the room. Captain Thorne stood behind the tactical display, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something that looked suspiciously like barely controlled panic. Master Sergeant Reeves paced near the wall-mounted maps, his weathered face grim with the expression of someone who just received very bad news. Blake Sullivan sat in the front row, his hands clasped tightly in his lap to hide their trembling, his eyes fixed on the briefing materials with an intensity that spoke of desperate hope that somehow this mission might be different, that somehow his legendary abilities might return when they were truly needed. Lieutenant Amanda Cross, the base intelligence officer, stepped forward with a folder marked with classification stamps that made Kiara's trained eye narrow with interest. Cross was normally unflappable, the kind of professional who delivered briefings about potential threats with the same emotional detachment she might use to discuss weather patterns. But this morning, something in her voice carried an edge that made everyone in the room lean forward. "Gentlemen, and Sergeant Delacroix," Cross began, nodding toward Kiara with the casual acknowledgement typically reserved for support personnel, "we have received actionable intelligence regarding a high-value target that presents both an unprecedented opportunity and an extreme operational challenge." She activated the digital display, revealing satellite imagery of a compound nestled in the mountainous terrain approximately 26 kilometers from their position. The resolution was sharp enough to show individual vehicles and guard positions, but the distance and elevation changes created a tactical puzzle that made several of the assembled soldiers exchange uncertain glances. Target designation is Colonel Yusuf al-Harazi, former Republican Guard officer and current operational commander for the Ansar al-Jihad network throughout this region. Intelligence estimates he's responsible for coordinating attacks that have killed over 200 coalition personnel in the past 18 months. The name sent a ripple through the room. Al-Harazi was legendary among insurgent leaders, a tactician whose operations were characterized by military precision and brutal effectiveness. He'd been on the Joint Special Operations Command's priority target list for over 2 years, but it proven frustratingly elusive, moving constantly and surrounding himself with security measures that made direct assault impractical. Tomorrow at 1400 hours, al-Harazi will be conducting a strategic meeting with his regional commanders at this compound. Signal intelligence indicates this will be the largest gathering of Ansar al-Jihad leadership in over 3 years. The opportunity to eliminate their entire command structure is unprecedented. Captain Thorne stepped forward, his voice carrying the forced confidence of someone trying to convince himself as much as his audience. The mission parameters are straightforward. We establish an overwatch position and eliminate the target when he presents himself. Clean, surgical, minimal collateral damage.
But Master Sergeant Reeves had been studying the tactical display with the experienced eye of someone who'd planned dozens of similar operations, and his expression suggested that nothing about this mission would be straightforward. "Distance to target?" he asked, although his tone suggested he already suspected the answer wouldn't be encouraging.
Lieutenant Cross consulted her briefing materials, and when she spoke, her voice carried the clinical detachment of someone delivering a death sentence. 4.2 miles, approximately 6,700 meters. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the normal background sounds of the vase seemed to pause as the implications of that distance sank in. 4 miles wasn't just long-range shooting. It was beyond the theoretical limits of precision marksmanship for all but the most exceptional equipment and operators. It was the kind of shot that existed in classified records and legend, attempted by only a handful of snipers in military history. Blake Sullivan's face had gone pale, his hands now trembling visibly despite his efforts to control them. Everyone in the room knew his reputation, knew his records, knew that if anyone at Combat Outpost Viper could make such a shot, it would be him. But watching his reaction, seeing the fear that had replaced his legendary confidence, made it clear that the man who might have once attempted such a feat was no longer present. "Environmental factors?" Reeves asked, his voice carefully neutral as he avoided looking directly at Blake. Cross activated another display showing meteorological data and terrain analysis. Variable crosswinds gusting 15 to 25 knots, thermals creating significant mirage effects, elevation differential of approximately 800 feet between shooting position and target, temperature at time of engagement estimated at 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Each additional detail made the shot seem impossible. At 4 miles, environmental factors didn't just affect accuracy. They could make the difference between a successful engagement and a complete miss by dozens of feet. The bullet flight time alone would be nearly 6 seconds, during which wind, temperature, and atmospheric pressure could push the projectile off course in ways that would challenge even the most sophisticated ballistic computers. Kiara found herself automatically running calculations in her mind, processing wind speeds, bullet drop, and the complex mathematics of extreme-range ballistics with the unconscious precision of someone who'd spent years perfecting such calculations. The numbers were daunting, but not impossible for someone with the right equipment, the right training, and most importantly, the right mental state. Time window for the shot? Captain Thorne asked, though something in his voice suggested he was hoping the answer might provide some excuse to abort the mission entirely. Intelligence indicates Al-Harazi will be exposed for approximately 3 minutes during his arrival at the compound. He'll exit his vehicle, conduct a brief security consultation with his guards, then proceed directly into the main building. After that, he'll remain undercover for the duration of the meeting. 3 minutes. At 4 miles distance, with environmental factors that would challenge the most sophisticated equipment and a target who would be visible for less time than it took to make a cup of coffee, the mission parameters weren't just difficult, they bordered on impossible. Blake cleared his throat, the sound rough and uncertain in the quiet briefing room. Equipment considerations? Standard military rifles won't have the range for reliable accuracy at that distance. Cross nodded, activating another display showing specialized sniper systems. Procurement has authorized deployment of an M107A1 Barrett 50 caliber system with advanced ballistic computer integration. The weapon will be delivered by helicopter this afternoon, along with specialized ammunition and targeting systems. The Barrett 50 caliber was among the most powerful precision rifles in military inventory, capable of engaging targets at distances that would be impossible with smaller calibers. But even with such equipment, a 4-mile shot remained at the very edge of theoretical possibility, requiring not just superior equipment, but operator skills that bordered on superhuman. Mission timeline, Thorne asked, and Kiara could hear the reluctance in his voice as he began to understand the full scope of what was being asked. Insertion tonight at 2200 hours. Establish overwatch position before dawn. Conduct surveillance and preparation throughout the morning. Engage target at 1400 hours. Extraction immediately following mission completion. Cross paused, looking directly at Blake Sullivan. Given the specialized nature of this operation, Sergeant Major Sullivan will be primary shooter, with standard spotter support. Blake's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white with the effort of maintaining control. Everyone in the room could see his distress, but military protocol and his own reputation made it impossible for him to admit that the man they were counting on to make the most important shot of their careers was psychologically incapable of even basic marksmanship. "Questions?" Thorne asked, though his tone suggested he hoped there would be none. Kiara raised her hand, maintaining her facade as the invisible communications specialist while her tactical mind processed every aspect of the briefing. Backup communication protocols? If primary shooter is compromised, what are contingency plans? It was a reasonable question from someone responsible for communications, but Cross and Thorne exchanged glances that suggested contingency planning hadn't extended beyond hoping their legendary sniper could overcome his obvious psychological crisis through sheer force of will. "Standard extraction protocols apply," Thorne said finally, "but mission success depends on primary engagement. There is no backup shooter qualified for this type of operation." The briefing concluded with logistical details and equipment assignments, but everyone present understood the underlying reality. Combat Outpost Viper's most important mission in months depended entirely on Blake Sullivan recovering abilities that had been deteriorating for weeks. They were betting 47 lives on the hope that their broken legend could perform a miracle that would challenge even a healthy operator at the peak of their abilities. As personnel filed out of the briefing room, Kiara remained behind, ostensibly organizing her notes, while actually observing Blake Sullivan. He sat alone in the front row, staring at the satellite imagery with the expression of a man contemplating his own execution. His hands shook as he reached for his water bottle, and she could see the sweat beginning to bead on his forehead despite the morning coolness. Tomorrow at 1400 hours, Blake Sullivan would be expected to make the most impossible shot of his career. And watching him struggle with the basic motor control required to hold a water bottle steady, Kiara knew with absolute certainty that he would fail. The question was, what happened to 47 American soldiers when their primary protection evaporated in the mountains of Somalia, and whether the invisible communication specialist who'd spent 3 years hiding from her own legendary abilities was prepared to stop hiding when failure meant death for everyone she'd sworn to protect.
The Barrett M107A1 arrived at Combat Outpost Viper at 1530 hours, delivered by a Black Hawk helicopter that touched down just long enough to offload the specialized equipment before disappearing back into the desert heat shimmer. The rifle was a masterpiece of military engineering, 57 inches of precision-manufactured depth, capable of engaging targets at distances that defied conventional understanding of marksmanship. Blake Sullivan approached the weapon with the reverence typically reserved for religious artifacts, his hands trembling slightly as he began the ritual of inspection and familiarization that had once been as natural as breathing. But Kiara, observing from her position coordinating communications equipment for the mission, could see that something fundamental had changed in the way Blake interacted with his tools. Where once his movements had been fluid and confident, now they were hesitant, uncertain. His hands lingered over each component as if he were trying to remember procedures that had been muscle memory for over a decade. The Barrett's controls and adjustments that should have been automatic now seemed to require conscious effort, as if Blake were relearning skills he'd mastered years ago. Master Sergeant Reeves had established a training range using the same distance and elevation parameters they would face during the actual mission. 4 miles across the desert valley, a series of targets had been positioned to simulate the compound where Colonel Al-Harazi would appear. The afternoon sun created thermals that danced across the landscape like liquid mercury, turning the distant mountains into wavering mirages that would challenge even the most sophisticated optics. "Let's see what this beast can do,"
Blake muttered, settling into his shooting position, with movements that looked practiced but felt wrong. Kiara could see the subtle differences, the way his body alignment wasn't quite perfect, the slight tremor in his hands as he adjusted the scoop, the rapid breathing that replaced the controlled respiratory patterns that had made him legendary. Corporal Mason Torres had been assigned as Blake's spotter, carrying high-powered optics and range-finding equipment that would help calculate the complex ballistics required for the shot. Torres was competent and enthusiastic, but he lacked the experience to recognize that his primary shooter was falling apart under the pressure of expectations that had once defined his entire identity. Range to target 6,847 meters, Torres called out, consulting his laser rangefinder and ballistic computer. Wind speed variable, gusting from northwest at 15 to 25 knots. Temperature 112 degrees in climbing. Blake nodded, making minute adjustments to his scope while his breathing became increasingly shallow. Through her position monitoring communications equipment, Kiara could hear his radio breathing pattern, rapid, irregular, the respiratory signature of someone fighting panic rather than preparing for precision shooting. The first shot thundered across the valley with the distinctive crack boom of the .5 caliber cartridge, its sound echoing off distant mountains like rolling thunder. At 4 miles distance, the bullet flight time was nearly 6 seconds, an eternity during which wind, thermals, and atmospheric pressure could push the projectile yards off course. Through her own spotting scope, requisitioned under the pretense of communication surveillance requirements, Kiara watched the impact point. Blake's round struck the hillside 40 feet to the left of the target, creating a dust cloud that marked a miss so complete it would have been embarrassing for a novice shooter, let alone someone of Blake's reputation. "Adjust right 4 minutes of angle," Torres called out, trying to maintain professional composure despite the magnitude of the error. A 4-minute adjustment represented a massive correction, the kind of ballistic error that suggested fundamental problems with either equipment or operator. Blake's hands were now visibly shaking as he made the scope adjustment, sweat pouring down his face despite the relatively cool afternoon temperature. His breathing had become so irregular that Kiara could hear it over the radio frequency. Rapid gasps that spoke of barely controlled panic rather than the disciplined respiratory control required for precision shooting. The second shot was worse than the first, impacting the ground nearly 60 feet short of the target. Blake's legendary abilities weren't just deteriorating, they were collapsing completely under the weight of psychological pressure that his conscious mind couldn't overcome. "Equipment problem," Blake announced, his voice cracking slightly as he attempted to maintain the fiction that his failures were mechanical rather than mental. "The scope calibration is off. Need to run diagnostics." But Master Sergeant Reeves had been watching through his own optics, and his weathered face carried the grim expression of someone who'd witnessed too many good soldiers break under pressure to mistake equipment failure for psychological collapse.
"Blake," Reeves said quietly, approaching the shooting position with the careful movements of someone approaching a wounded animal. "Maybe we should call it a day. Get some rest before tomorrow." "Negative," Blake replied, his voice carrying a desperate edge that made everyone within earshot understand that they were witnessing something painful and personal. "Just need to work through the calibration issues. One more adjustment." The third shot missed the entire target area, impacting harmlessly into the desert sand more than 100 feet from where it should have struck. Blake's legendary precision had completely evaporated, replaced by wild shooting that wouldn't have qualified him for basic infantry training. From her concealed position, Kiara watched Blake's complete breakdown with a mixture of professional recognition and personal sympathy. She'd experienced her own version of the same psychological collapse 3 years earlier, understood exactly how the mind's survival mechanisms could sabotage the very skills that defined a warrior's identity. But where her breakdown had been private, contained, leading to a voluntary withdrawal from operational duties, Blake's was happening in full view of soldiers who depended on his abilities for their survival.
Captain Thorne appeared at the training range, drawn by reports of the disastrous shooting performance and the implications for tomorrow's mission. His usual confidence had been replaced by barely concealed panic as he watched their primary asset demonstrate conclusively that he was incapable of the precision required for mission success. "How's the training going?" Thorne asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer from the expressions on everyone's faces. "Equipment needs adjustment," Blake repeated, but his voice lacked conviction. Everyone present could see his hands shaking, could hear the irregular breathing, could observe the sweat and tremors that spoke of psychological crisis rather than mechanical problems. Torres, young and inexperienced but not blind, was beginning to understand that something fundamental was wrong with his shooting partner. "Sergeant Major," he said carefully, "maybe we should try again tomorrow morning when conditions are different?" But Blake was beyond rational decision-making, trapped by his reputation and the expectations of 47 American soldiers who believed their survival depended on abilities he could no longer access. "One more shot," he insisted, his voice carrying the desperate quality of someone trying to convince themselves as much as others. "Just need to get the feel back." The fourth shot didn't even impact in the general target area, striking a rock formation nearly 200 yards from where it should have hit. The miss was so complete, so utterly divorced from Blake's legendary reputation, that the assembled soldiers fell into uncomfortable silence as they processed what they were witnessing. Blake Sullivan, the Ghost, the sniper whose reputation had protected Combat Outpost Viper for 2 years, was completely incapable of basic marksmanship, let alone the impossible precision required for tomorrow's mission. His legendary abilities had been replaced by wild, uncontrolled shooting that wouldn't qualify him for security guard duty at a shopping mall. "That's enough for today," Reeves announced, with the authority of someone who'd seen enough to make a command decision. "We'll reassess equipment status in the morning." But everyone present understood that the morning wouldn't bring miraculous recovery. Blake Sullivan's breakdown was complete, psychological, and irreversible under current circumstances. Tomorrow's mission, which depended entirely on his precision shooting abilities, was doomed before it began. As the training session dissolved into uncomfortable silence and equipment cleanup, Kiara remained at her communications post, ostensibly monitoring radio frequencies while actually processing the tactical implications of what she'd witnessed. Blake's complete inability to perform meant that 47 American soldiers would be depending on a plan that had just proven impossible to execute. Unless someone else stepped forward, someone whose legendary abilities had been buried under 3 years of careful anonymity but had never actually disappeared. Someone who'd been automatically calculating wind speeds, bullet trajectories, and ballistic solutions while watching Blake's collapse through her spotting scope. The desert evenings settled over Combat Outpost Viper with the weight of impending disaster, carrying the knowledge that tomorrow's mission would either end in failure or force someone to reveal abilities that had been hidden for 3 years beneath the carefully constructed facade of an invisible communications specialist. Blake Sullivan walked back toward the base with his shoulders slumped in defeat, carrying equipment he could no longer use effectively. Behind him, unnoticed and unremarkable, Kiara Delacroix continued her communications duties while her tactical mind processed every detail of the shot he would never be able to make, and the one she might have to attempt if 47 lives were going to survive the next 24 hours.
The mess hall at Combat Outpost Viper fell silent when Blake Sullivan entered for the evening meal, his usual confident stride replaced by the uncertain movements of someone who no longer trusted his own body. Word of the disastrous training session had spread through the base with the inevitable efficiency of military gossip, and 47 soldiers were now processing the reality that their primary protection had evaporated in a single afternoon. Blake moved through the chow line mechanically, accepting food he wouldn't eat while avoiding the eyes of soldiers who depended on his legendary reputation for 2 years. The weight of their expectations, combined with his complete inability to meet them, created a psychological pressure that was visibly crushing him with each passing hour. Kiara observed from her usual corner table, maintaining her facade as the invisible communications specialist while cataloging every detail of Blake's deterioration. His hands shook as he carried his tray, causing silverware to rattle against the plastic surface. His breathing remained irregular, the rapid, shallow pattern of someone fighting constant panic. Most telling was the way he'd begun to flinch at sudden sounds, the slam of a door, the scrape of a chair, the normal cacophony of military life now triggering hyper-vigilant responses that spoke of a nervous system pushed beyond its breaking point. After forcing down perhaps 3 bites of his untouched meal, Blake stood abruptly and walked toward the exit with the jerky movements of someone whose psychological control was hanging by threads. But instead of heading toward his quarters, he turned toward the communications bunker where Kiara spent most of her duty hours. She found him 20 minutes later, sitting alone in the darkened radio room, staring at his hands as they trembled in his lap. The legendary sniper who'd once been the most feared marksman and Special Operations Command looked like a broken man contemplating the wreckage of his identity. "Sergeant Major?" she said quietly, maintaining the respectful distance appropriate for their supposed ranks while her trained eye assessed his psychological state. Blake looked up with eyes that carried the hollow expression of someone who'd lost everything that defined their sense of self. "Can't stop them from shaking," he said, holding up his hands and watching the tremors with the detached fascination of someone observing their own destruction. "Been trying for hours. Can't make them steady anymore." Kiara closed the bunker door behind her, ensuring their conversation would remain private, then sat across from Blake with the careful movements of someone approaching a wounded animal. "How long since you've slept properly?" 3 months. Not since the Core Valley incident. Every time I close my eyes, I see that target, see my hands shaking, see the shot I couldn't take." His voice carried the flat monotone of someone reciting facts that had become torture. The Core Valley incident, Kiara had read the after-action reports, understood that Blake's psychological breakdown had begun with a single moment of failure that his mind had transformed into a defining trauma. One missed opportunity had shattered the confidence of a man whose entire identity was built on precision under pressure. "The medication isn't helping?" she asked, though she already knew the answer from observing his symptoms. Blake laughed, a sound devoid of humor that echoed strangely in the radio room. "Doc Martinez has me on enough anti-anxiety medication to sedate a horse. All it does is make me drowsy while my hands keep shaking. Can't treat fear with pharmaceuticals, turns out." He looked directly at her for the first time, and Kiara saw something in his expression that made her understand this conversation was moving toward dangerous territory. "Tomorrow's mission," he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. 4 miles. Impossible shot even when I was at my best. Now? He held up his trembling hands. "Might as well send Private Torres out there with a slingshot." The admission hung between them like a confession, loaded with implications that could destroy careers and get people killed. Blake Sullivan, the ghost, was admitting complete incapacity to perform the mission that 47 lives depended on. "Captain Thorne still expects you to. Captain Thorne is pretending this will magically resolve itself because acknowledging reality means accepting that we're all about to die. 4 miles, Delacroix, in desert thermals with crosswinds against a target they'll be exposed for 3 minutes. I can't hit a barn door at 400 meters right now." Kiara felt the weight of the moment, understanding that Blake's confession was leading towards something that would force her to make decisions she'd been avoiding for 3 years. "What are you asking me?"
Blake was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands with the expression of someone trying to solve an impossible equation. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of desperate hope that made Kiara's chest tighten with recognition. "You know things," he said quietly, "about ballistics, about shooting, about things that communications specialists shouldn't know. I've watched you during training exercises, seen how you automatically calculate wind patterns, noticed details that most infantry soldiers miss entirely." The observation hit like a physical blow.
Despite 3 years of careful anonymity, Blake's trained eye had detected the unconscious behaviors that marked her true background. Her cover, so carefully maintained, was beginning to crack under the scrutiny of someone who understood the warrior mindset intimately. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said quietly. "The way you hold yourself during combat drills, the way your eyes track movement patterns, the way you unconsciously check wind direction every morning." Blake's voice gained strength as he continued, as if speaking these observations aloud was giving him the first hope he'd felt in months. "You move like someone who's been under fire, who's made life-and-death decisions under pressure." Kiara remained silent, but her tactical mind was racing through implications and possibilities. Blake's psychological breakdown was complete, irreversible under current circumstances. Tomorrow's mission would fail catastrophically unless someone else stepped forward, someone with the skills to make an impossible shot that would save 47 lives. "I need to know," he continued, his voice carrying the desperate quality of someone whose last hope was sitting across from him in a darkened radio room. "Are you who I think you are? Because if you are, if you have the background I suspect, then maybe tomorrow doesn't have to end with all of us dead." The question hung in the air between them, loaded with 3 years of carefully maintained secrets, and the weight of a confession that could change everything. Kiara looked at Blake Sullivan, broken, desperate, clinging to the possibility that his invisible communications specialist might be the answer to an impossible tactical problem. Her hands, she noticed, were perfectly steady, had been steady for 3 years, through combat drills and emergency situations and the constant stress of maintaining a false identity. While Blake's legendary abilities had crumbled under psychological pressure, hers had remained intact, buried but functional, waiting for a moment when hiding was no longer possible. "Staff Sergeant Kiara Delacroix," she said quietly, using her current rank and identity like a shield. "Communications specialist. That's who I am officially. And unofficially?" The weight of the question pressed down on her like physical force. Blake's eyes held the desperate hope of someone whose last chance was sitting across from him in military-issue furniture, surrounded by radio equipment and the accumulated detritus of a carefully maintained lie. Kiara took a deep breath, feeling 3 years of anonymity beginning to crack under the pressure of necessity and the reality that tomorrow would bring consequences that couldn't be avoided through careful hiding. "Unofficially," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "Master Sergeant Phoenix, Marine Corps Scout Sniper. Longest confirmed kill, 2,847 meters. Military record for precision shooting under combat conditions." She paused, meeting Blake's eyes directly for the first time since the conversation began. "Discharged 3 years ago after psychological evaluation recommended removal from operational duties." Blake's expression cycled through disbelief, recognition, and something that might have been relief so profound it bordered on a religious experience. The invisible communications specialist who'd spent 9 months filing his paperwork was not just qualified to make tomorrow's impossible shot, she was probably the only person at Combat Outpost Viper capable of attempting it. "Phoenix," he repeated. The call sign carried weight and recognition. "I've heard that name. Fallujah operations, precision work that became legend in sniper community." "That was a different person," Kiara said, but her voice lacked conviction. "She exists," Blake replied with sudden certainty. "She's been hiding, but she exists. And tomorrow, 47 people are going to need her to stop hiding and remember who she used to be." The desert night pressed against the bunker walls, carrying with it the weight of decisions that couldn't be postponed and truths that could no longer be buried under carefully maintained anonymity. In 12 hours, Colonel Al-Harazi would present himself as a target that required abilities Blake Sullivan no longer possessed. But sitting in the darkness, looking at hands that hadn't trembled in 3 years, despite everything she'd experienced, Kiara began to understand that some secrets were too dangerous to maintain when lives hung on the balance.
The insertion began at 2200 hours under a moonless sky that turned the Somali highlands into a landscape of shadows and whispered movement. Captain Thorne had assembled the mission team in the equipment bay, his usual confident demeanor replaced by the forced professionalism of someone trying to convince himself that a fundamentally flawed plan might somehow succeed through sheer determination. Blake Sullivan stood with the mission gear arranged around him like artifacts from a career that had already ended, though no one was willing to acknowledge that reality. The Barrett M107A1 rested in its case, 57 inches of precision engineering that would be useless in the hands of someone whose psychological state had deteriorated beyond recovery. His hands shook as he checked his equipment list, movements that had once been automatic now requiring conscious effort to complete. Communication support will establish relay protocols from overwatch position, Thorne announced, gesturing toward Kiara with the casual dismissal typically reserved for personnel whose primary function was logistical rather than tactical. Sergeant Delacroix, you'll monitor frequencies and coordinate extraction when the mission is complete. Kiara nodded with the practiced invisibility she perfected over 9 months, accepting her assigned role while her tactical mind processed every detail of the mission profile. Her communications equipment included items that no standard radio operator would require: advanced ballistic computers disguised as signal processing devices, range-finding equipment masked as antenna alignment tools, and specialized optics that could pass casual inspection as communications gear, but were actually precision instruments capable of supporting extreme range shooting. The trek to the overwatch position covered 12 kilometers of mountainous terrain that would challenge even experienced infantry under the best conditions. In darkness, carrying specialized equipment with environmental factors that included loose scree, unexpected drop-offs, and the constant possibility of insurgent patrols, the movement required skills that went far beyond basic military training. Blake struggled from the beginning, his psychological condition manifesting in physical symptoms that made the grueling hike exponentially more difficult. His breathing became labored within the first kilometer, not from physical exertion, but from the panic attacks that struck whenever he processed the weight of equipment he was carrying and the mission he was expected to complete. Sweat poured down his face despite the cool mountain air, and his movements became increasingly uncoordinated as psychological pressure overwhelmed his motor control. Corporal Torres, serving as Blake's spotter and security, watched his partner's deterioration with growing concern. The young soldier had heard legends about the ghost's legendary abilities, but witnessing Blake's current condition made it clear that reputation and reality had diverged in ways that could get everyone killed. "You okay, Sergeant Major?" Torres whispered during their first west halt, noting Blake's irregular breathing and the way his hands shook as he adjusted his equipment straps. "Just working through some equipment issues," Blake replied, but his voice carried the hollow quality of someone whose lies were becoming increasingly transparent. "Need to get the feel back for this rifle system." Kiara maintained her position as rear security, ostensibly monitoring communications frequencies, while actually observing Blake's continued breakdown with professional assessment. Her own movement through the terrain was fluid, automatic, the unconscious efficiency of someone who'd spent years operating in hostile environments. Despite carrying supposedly non-combat equipment, she navigated obstacles and terrain features with the practiced ease of someone whose muscle memory was permanently calibrated for tactical movement. The overwatch position was a rocky outcropping that provided clear lines of sight across the valley where Colonel Al-Harasi's compound sat like a cluster of concrete and steel in the distance. At 6,700 meters, the buildings were barely visible to the naked eye. Tiny geometric shapes that wavered in the residual heat from the previous day's desert temperatures. Blake established his shooting position with movements that looked familiar but felt wrong, his body going through motions that his nervous system no longer trusted. The Barrett's bipod legs scraped against rock as his hands trembled, the sound harsh in the pre-dawn silence. Every adjustment to the rifle's position required multiple attempts as his fine motor control continued to deteriorate under psychological pressure.
Range to target confirmed at 6,847 meters, Torres called softly, consulting his laser rangefinder and ballistic computer. Wind speed variable, currently gusting from northwest at 18 knots. Temperature dropping to 94 degrees, humidity at 12%. The environmental data painted a picture of extreme shooting conditions that would challenge the most sophisticated equipment and operators. At nearly 4 miles distance, factors that might cause minor deviations at normal ranges could result in misses measured in dozens of feet. The bullet flight time would be approximately 5.8 seconds, during which wind patterns, thermals, and atmospheric pressure changes could push the projectile off course in ways that defied prediction.
Kiara established her communications position 20 meters behind the shooting team, supposedly focused on maintaining radio contact with Combat Outpost Viper, while actually conducting her own tactical assessment of the shot requirements. Through optics that officially belonged to her communications equipment, but were actually precision instruments, she began calculating the complex ballistics that would be required for mission success. Wind patterns at 6,800 meters weren't uniform. Thermal columns rising from the sun-heated valley floor created pockets of turbulence that would affect bullet trajectory in unpredictable ways. The temperature differential between their elevated position and the target area would cause atmospheric density variations that could push rounds high or low depending on precise timing. Most challenging was the target's brief exposure window, 3 minutes during which environmental conditions could change significantly. Through her concealed observations, Kiara watched Blake attempt to establish a stable shooting platform. His body positioning was technically correct, but lacked the unconscious precision that separated adequate marksmen from legendary snipers. His breathing patterns remained irregular. The controlled respiratory cycles that enabled precision shooting were replaced by the shallow, rapid breathing of barely controlled panic. "Target acquisition in approximately 4 hours," Blake announced, his voice carrying forced confidence that didn't match his visible condition. "Need to complete final rifle zeroing and environmental calculations." But the zeroing process revealed the full extent of Blake's psychological collapse. At a reduced range of 800 meters, a distance that should have been automatic for someone of his reputation, his shot group scattered across multiple feet of target area. Each missed shot triggered visible flinching, causing subsequent rounds to be even less accurate as his nervous system anticipated recoil and failure. Torres watched the disastrous shooting performance with growing alarm. "Equipment malfunction?" he asked hopefully, though his tone suggested he already understood the problem wasn't mechanical. "Scope issues," Blake replied, but his hands were shaking so badly that he couldn't maintain steady optics alignment. "Need to recalibrate. Environmental factors affecting the system." From her position, Kiara observed every detail of Blake's breakdown while maintaining her communications cover. Her own equipment included backup rifles and precision optics that could theoretically substitute for the Barrett system if necessary. More importantly, her hands remained steady, her breathing controlled, her tactical mind automatically processing wind patterns and ballistic requirements with the unconscious efficiency of someone whose abilities had never actually diminished. They'd simply been hidden. The pre-dawn darkness began giving way to the gray light that preceded sunrise, revealing the compound in the distance with increasing clarity. Through high-powered optics, individual buildings became visible, vehicles could be distinguished, and the movement patterns of security personnel began to emerge. In 6 hours, Colonel Al-Harazi would arrive at that compound for a meeting that represented the most significant intelligence opportunity in months. Blake's continued inability to achieve basic accuracy at 800 meters made it clear that the 6,800-meter shot required for mission success was beyond his current capabilities. His legendary precision had been replaced by wild, uncontrolled shooting that wouldn't qualify him for basic infantry training. As the morning progressed and Blake's condition continued to deteriorate, Kiara found herself facing a decision that would force her to choose between maintaining 3 years of carefully constructed anonymity or revealing abilities that could save 47 lives. The mission timeline was inflexible. Al-Harazi would appear on schedule, present himself as a target for exactly 3 minutes, then disappear into the compound where he'd remain undercover indefinitely. Through her spotting scope, disguised as communications equipment, Kiara began making the precise calculations that Blake's psychological condition no longer allowed him to complete. wind speed, atmospheric pressure, temperature gradients, bullet drop compensation, and the complex trigonometry required for extreme range precision shooting. The mathematics came as naturally as breathing, numbers flowing through her mind with the automatic precision that once made her legendary. The desert sun climbed higher, bringing with it thermals that would complicate the shot and environmental conditions that challenged even the most sophisticated ballistic computers. In the distance, the compound waited like a stage set for a performance that would either succeed spectacularly or fail catastrophically. Blake Sullivan, the ghost, sat behind his rifle with hands that trembled and eyes that held the hollow expression of someone whose identity had been shattered by psychological forces beyond his control. And 20 meters away, invisible and unremarkable, Master Sergeant Phoenix prepared for the possibility that her 3 years of hiding were about to end in the most public way imaginable. At 13:47 hours, the convoy appeared on the horizon like a line of ants moving across the desert floor, their dust trail visible long before individual vehicles could be distinguished through high-powered optics. Lieutenant Cross's intelligence had been accurate. Colonel Al-Harazi was approaching the compound precisely on schedule, his 3-vehicle security detail moving with the disciplined coordination that spoke of military training rather than improvised insurgent tactics. Blake Sullivan pressed his eye to the Barrett's scope, his breathing already irregular as the moment he'd been dreading for months finally arrived. Through the powerful optics, he could see the compound's main building, where Al-Harazi would conduct his strategic meeting, but his hands were shaking so badly that maintaining a stable sight picture was becoming impossible. Target convoy confirmed approaching from southwest, Torres whispered into his radio, providing real-time intelligence to Combat Outpost Viper while consulting his range-finding equipment. 3 vehicles, estimated 12 to 15 personnel, proceeding directly to primary building. From her communications position, Kiara monitored the radio traffic while conducting her own tactical assessment through optics that were far more sophisticated than her cover story required. The convoy's movement patterns, the spacing between vehicles, the way security personnel deployed as they approached the compound, everything suggested professional military planning rather than the casual violence typically associated with insurgent operations. Al-Harazi's reputation for tactical sophistication was proving accurate. His security measures included counter-sniper protocols that positioned vehicles to block potential shooting angles, placed guards in locations that provided overlapping fields of fire, and minimized exposure time through coordinated movement that spoke of extensive training. Range to target building, 6,847 meters, Torres continued his updates, though his voice carried increasing concern as he observed Blake's condition. Wind speed steady at 22 knots from northwest, gusting to 28. Temperature now at 108 degrees. Blake attempted to steady his rifle, but the tremors in his hands were transmitted directly through the weapon system to his scope picture. The distant compound wavered and jumped in his optics, making precise target identification impossible, even before considering the complexities of extreme-range ballistics. At 13:59 hours, the convoy reached the compound's main gate. Security personnel deployed with practiced efficiency, establishing a defensive perimeter that would protect Al-Harazi during his brief exposure between vehicle and building. The coordination was flawless, professional, and designed specifically to minimize the kind of precision shooting opportunity that Blake Sullivan no longer possessed the ability to exploit. "Target dismounting now," Torres announced, his voice tight with professional tension. Through his spotting scope, he could see Al-Harazi emerging from the lead vehicle, a tall figure in traditional robes whose movement pattern suggested someone accustomed to operating in hostile environments where snipers might be watching from distant ridgelines. Blake's breathing became rapid and shallow, the controlled respiratory patterns required for precision shooting completely abandoned as panic overwhelmed his nervous system. Sweat poured down his face despite the relatively cool mountain air, and his finger found the Barrett's trigger with movements that lacked any semblance of the controlled precision that had once made him legendary. Through her own optics, Kiara watched the target emerge from his vehicle and begin moving toward the building's main entrance. Al-Harazi would be exposed for exactly the time intelligence had predicted, approximately 3 minutes during which he would conduct a security consultation with his guards before proceeding into the compound where he'd remain undercover for the duration of his strategic meeting. The target was visible. The environmental conditions were as favorable as they would ever be, and the mission timeline was proceeding exactly as planned. Everything was perfect, except for the fact that their primary shooter was experiencing a complete psychological collapse that made accurate shooting at any range impossible, let alone the 6,847-meter shot required for mission success. "I can't," Blake whispered, his voice barely audible even to Torres, who was positioned immediately beside him. "My hands won't stop shaking, can't hold the sight picture steady." The admission hung in the mountain air like a death sentence. 47 American soldiers had spent months depending on Blake Sullivan's legendary abilities, and at the moment when those abilities were most needed, their guardian had become incapable of basic marksmanship. Torres stared at his shooting partner with growing horror as he processed the implications. "Blake, you have to try. He's going to disappear in 2 minutes. This is our only chance." But Blake's psychological breakdown was complete and irreversible. His hands trembled so violently that he couldn't maintain contact with the rifle's controls. His breathing had become panicked gasping that made controlled shooting impossible. Most critically, his nerve, the intangible quality that separated adequate marksmen from legendary snipers, had been completely shattered by months of deteriorating confidence and the weight of expectations he could no longer meet. Through her spotting scope, Kiara watched Al-Harazi continue his security consultation while her tactical mind automatically calculated the ballistic requirements for the shot Blake couldn't make. Wind speed at the target area was different from their elevated position, creating crosswind components that would push a bullet significantly left of point of aim. The temperature differential between shooting position and target created atmospheric density variations that would affect trajectory in precisely predictable ways if the shooter possessed the skills to compensate for them. 1 minute and 40 seconds remaining in the exposure window. Blake attempted to settle behind his rifle one final time, but his psychological condition had deteriorated beyond any possibility of recovery. The legendary precision that had protected Combat Outpost Viper for 2 years was gone, replaced by wild tremors and panic responses that made him more dangerous to his own team than to any enemy target. "I can't do it," he said, his voice cracking with the finality of absolute defeat. "Torres, you have to try. Take the shot." But Torres was a competent spotter, not a precision marksman trained for extreme range shooting. His skills, while adequate for normal military operations, were completely insufficient for a shot that challenged the theoretical limits of rifle marksmanship. The Barrett M107A1 might as well have been a medieval catapult in his inexperienced hands. 1 minute and 15 seconds remaining. Through her optics, Kiara watched Al-Harazi continue his security consultation and begin moving toward the building entrance. In 75 seconds, he would disappear into the compound where he'd remain undercover indefinitely. The opportunity that had taken months to develop, that represented the most significant intelligence breakthrough in their area of operations, was evaporating while their primary shooter experienced a complete psychological collapse. The decision formed in her mind with crystalline clarity. 3 years of carefully maintained anonymity, 3 years of pretending to be invisible support staff, 3 years of hiding abilities that had never actually diminished, all of it became irrelevant in the face of 47 lives that depended on someone stepping forward when their designated protector could no longer function. "Torres," she called quietly, her voice carrying a note of authority that made the young corporal turn toward her with surprise. "Move away from the rifle. What are you?" "Move away from the rifle. Now."
There was something in her tone, some fundamental shift from invisible communications specialist to operational authority, that made Torres step back without further questions. Blake looked up from his scope with eyes that mixed confusion with desperate hope, as if some part of him had been waiting for this moment. Kiara approached the Barrett's position with movements that were fluid, confident, and utterly divorced from the careful anonymity she'd maintained for 9 months. Her hands moved across the weapon system with automatic precision, checking chamber status, confirming scope settings, and making minute adjustments that spoke of muscle memory developed through thousands of repetitions. 58 seconds remaining. She settled into the shooting position with the unconscious efficiency of someone returning home after a long absence, her body automatically assuming the precise alignment required for extreme-range precision shooting. The Barrett felt familiar in her hands despite 3 years away from operational duties, its controls and characteristics as familiar as her own heartbeat.
Through the scope, El-Harazi appeared with startling clarity at maximum magnification. The target was moving with unhurried confidence toward the building entrance, unaware that 6,847 meters away, someone was acquiring him through precision optics while calculating wind speed, atmospheric pressure, temperature gradients, and the complex ballistics required to place a .50 caliber projectile across nearly 4 miles of desert air. 37 seconds remaining. Kiara's breathing fell into the controlled pattern that enabled precision shooting, her heart rate slowing as her nervous system shifted into the zone that elite marksmen spend lifetimes trying to achieve. Environmental factors that would challenge the most sophisticated ballistic computers became simple mathematics in her mind, numbers flowing together in calculations that accounted for every variable affecting bullet trajectory. Torres watched in stunned silence as their supposedly invisible communications specialist transformed into something entirely different. Her movements were economical, professional, and carried the absolute confidence of someone who had performed these actions countless times under the most extreme conditions imaginable. 22 seconds remaining. The crosshairs found their target with mathematical precision, El-Harazi's center mass visible through the scope as he paused at the building entrance for a final exchange with his security detail. In 18 seconds, he would disappear into the compound and the mission would end in failure. But Master Sergeant Phoenix had returned from 3 years of carefully maintained exile, and her legendary abilities had never actually disappeared. They'd simply been waiting for a moment when hiding was no longer possible, and 47 lives hung in the balance. Her finger found the trigger with movements that were automatic, precise, and as inevitable as physics itself.
Time dilated as Kiara's mind processed the ballistic calculations required for the most complex shot of her career. At 6,847 meters, environmental factors that might cause minor deviations at normal ranges could result in catastrophic misses measured in dozens of feet. The mathematics flowed through her consciousness with crystalline precision. Bullet drop compensation, wind drift correction, atmospheric pressure variations, and the Coriolis effect that would influence projectile trajectory over nearly 4 miles of flight path. Wind speed at the target area, 22 knots from the northwest, gusting to 28, but wind patterns weren't uniform across the distance. Thermal columns rising from the sun-heated valley floor created pockets of turbulence that would affect bullet trajectory in ways that challenged even the most sophisticated ballistic computers. Through years of experience and intuitive understanding of desert conditions, Kiara could visualize the invisible air currents that would influence her shot. Temperature differential between their elevated position at 94 degrees and the valley floor at 108 degrees created atmospheric density variations that would push rounds high if not properly compensated. The Barrett's .5 caliber projectile would lose approximately 847 feet of elevation due to gravity during its 5.8-second flight time, requiring precise holdover calculations that accounted for the specific ballistics of match-grade ammunition. 18 seconds remaining in the exposure window. Through her scope, El-Harazi paused at the building entrance, consulting with his security detail, while completely unaware that nearly 4 miles away, someone was preparing to demonstrate why Master Sergeant Phoenix had become legendary in precision shooting circles. His movement pattern suggested someone accustomed to operating in hostile environments, but his counter-sniper protocols had been designed for conventional threats at normal engagement ranges. Kiara's breathing fell into the rhythm that enabled precision shooting: controlled inhalation, partial exhalation, respiratory pause at natural breathing point where diaphragm movement wouldn't disturb rifle alignment. Her heart rate slowed to approximately 45 beats per minute, the physiological state that allowed her nervous system to function with mechanical precision. The Barrett's trigger had been adjusted to break at exactly 3.2 pounds of pressure, a setting that provided enough resistance to prevent accidental discharge while remaining light enough for precise control. Kiara's finger found the trigger face with movements that had been rehearsed through thousands of repetitions, applying rearward pressure with the pad of her index finger while her other hand maintained perfect grip consistency. 14 seconds remaining in the exposure window. Environmental calculations required instantaneous processing of variables that would challenge supercomputers. crosswind components at various altitudes along the bullet's trajectory, thermal effects that would create vertical deflection, atmospheric pressure variations that would affect projectile velocity, all of it synthesized into hold-off adjustments that positioned her crosshairs approximately 14 feet left and 32 feet high of Al-Harazi's visible position. To observers unfamiliar with extreme-range ballistics, her aim point would appear to be wildly inaccurate, as if she were targeting empty air far from the intended impact area. But physics demanded such corrections. At nearly 4 miles distance, environmental forces would push her projectile in precisely predictable directions if the calculations were accurate. Tourists watched in stunned silence as their communications specialist demonstrated ballistic knowledge that exceeded anything he'd learned in sniper school. Her scope adjustments were made with automatic precision, elevation and windage corrections applied through muscle memory that spoke of countless hours spent mastering the mathematics of extreme-range shooting. Blake Sullivan, despite his psychological breakdown, recognized what he was witnessing. "Full-value wind," he whispered, his voice carrying professional admiration that transcended his own failures. "Thermal effects pushing vertical. She's compensating for everything." 10 seconds remaining.
The crosshairs settled on their calculated aim point with mathematical precision. Kiara's scope picture rock steady, despite the environmental conditions that had made Blake's shooting impossible. Her breathing reached its natural respiratory pause, heart rate synchronized with the rhythm that enabled her legendary precision. Al-Harazi began his final movement toward the building entrance, his security detail maintaining protective positions that would be irrelevant against a threat they couldn't detect from nearly 4 miles away. In 6 seconds, he would disappear into the compound, and the mission would end in failure. Kiara's trigger finger applied steady rearward pressure, the Barrett's firing mechanism responding with mechanical precision that released forces beyond normal human experience. The .50 caliber cartridge contained enough energy to propel a 750-grain projectile at 2,820 feet per second, creating muzzle blast and recoil that would challenge even experienced operators. The rifle thundered against her shoulder with tremendous force, its report echoing across the mountainous terrain like rolling thunder. Muzzle flash illuminated their position briefly, and the Barrett's massive recoil drove the weapon several inches rearward despite its advanced recoil mitigation systems. But Kiara's body absorbed the punishment with practiced efficiency, her shooting platform designed to handle the Barrett's tremendous forces while maintaining the precise alignment required for follow-up shots if necessary. Her scope picture returned to target acquisition within seconds, allowing her to observe the bullet's impact through high-powered optics. 5.8 seconds of flight time stretched like eternity as physics carried her projectile across nearly 4 miles of desert air. Environmental forces that had been calculated with mathematical precision began affecting bullet trajectory, exactly as predicted. Wind drift pushing left, thermal effects creating vertical deviation, atmospheric pressure variations influencing velocity in ways that had been compensated for in her aim point selection. At the compound, Al-Harazi continued his movement toward the building entrance, completely unaware that death was traveling toward him at nearly 3 times the speed of sound. His security detail maintained their protective positions, scanning for threats at conventional ranges, while remaining oblivious to the precision shot originating from beyond the limits of normal engagement distances. The bullet's trajectory carried it through multiple atmospheric layers, each with different wind speeds and thermal characteristics that influenced its flight path. But Kiara's calculations had been precise. Her projectile tracked through the air exactly as ballistic mathematics demanded, environmental corrections proving accurate as the round maintained its intended course toward the target area. 4.2 seconds after firing, the .50 caliber projectile reached its maximum trajectory height before beginning its final descent toward the compound. Gravity and atmospheric resistance had reduced its velocity significantly, but the massive bullet retained enough energy to accomplish its intended purpose with devastating effectiveness. At precisely 5.8 seconds after Kiara's trigger press, physics and precision converged in an outcome that would be discussed in military circles for years. The bullet struck Al-Harazi's center mass with tremendous force. the impact creating a pink mist that hung in the desert air like a gruesome exclamation point, marking the end of his operational career. The target dropped instantly with the boneless finality that comes only from central nervous system disruption, his body collapsing in ways that made his security detail understand immediately that medical intervention would be futile. The precision shot had been perfect, mathematically calculated, environmentally compensated, and executed with the legendary skill that had once made Master Sergeant Phoenix famous throughout Special Operations Command. For 3 seconds, nothing changed at the compound. Al-Harazi's security detail continued their protective positions, processing what they'd witnessed, while their minds struggled to understand how their principal could have been engaged from distances that exceeded normal sniper capabilities. Then chaos erupted as they realized their commander was dead, killed by a shot that seemed to have originated from empty desert terrain. Radios exploded with panicked communications, vehicles started moving in multiple directions, and the disciplined security operation dissolved into confusion as personnel tried to locate a threat that operated from beyond their understanding of conventional engagement ranges. Torres stared through his spotting scope with the expression of someone who just witnessed a miracle that violated the laws of physics. "Holy mother of," he started to say, but couldn't finish the sentence. Through his magnified optics, he could see Al-Harazi's body surrounded by security personnel who were scanning frantically for threats they couldn't locate. Blake Sullivan, despite his psychological breakdown, understood exactly what he'd witnessed. The impossible shot that had been beyond his current capabilities had been executed with precision that exceeded anything in his legendary career. 6,847 meters. He whispered, his voice filled with professional admiration. "Perfect center mass hit. That's not just shooting, that's applied physics." Kiara cycled the Barrett's bolt action with mechanical precision, ejecting the spent cartridge while chambering a fresh round in case follow-up shots were required. But through her scope, she could see that the mission was complete. Al-Harazi was down, his security detail was in chaos, and the strategic meeting that had been months in planning would never occur. The compound erupted in activity as vehicles began evacuating personnel, their disciplined arrival replaced by panicked departure as Al-Harazi's death shattered the insurgent network's operational structure. In the space of 5.8 seconds, Master Sergeant Phoenix had eliminated a high-value target and crippled an entire terrorist organization through the precise application of ballistic mathematics and legendary marksmanship skills. Torres keyed his radio with hands that shook from adrenaline rather than fear. "Control, this is Overwatch. Target eliminated. Mission complete." The impossible shot had been made, but the real consequences were just beginning, because 37 American soldiers at Combat Outpost Viper were about to discover that their invisible communications specialist was actually one of the most legendary snipers in military history.
The helicopter extraction arrived 47 minutes after mission completion, its rotors cutting through the desert air with mechanical precision as the pilot navigated toward their concealed position. The Black Hawk touched down in a swirl of dust and rotor wash, its crew chief already preparing for rapid departure as the mission team loaded their equipment with practiced efficiency. During the flight back to Combat Outpost Viper, Torres sat in stunned silence, occasionally glancing at Kiara with the expression of someone trying to reconcile two completely incompatible versions of reality. The quiet communications specialist who'd helped him fill out paperwork for 9 months had just executed the most impossible shot he'd ever witnessed, demonstrating precision that exceeded anything in his military experience. Blake Sullivan, despite his psychological breakdown, possessed enough professional knowledge to understand the significance of what he'd observed. 6,847 meters, he repeated to himself during the flight, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and disbelief. Perfect environmental compensation. That wasn't luck. That was applied mathematics at the highest level. The helicopter settled onto Combat Outpost Viper's landing pad as afternoon shadows began stretching across the desert floor. Word of the mission's success had already reached base personnel through radio communications,
but the specific details of how Al-Harazi had been eliminated remained classified until official debriefing procedures could be completed. Captain Thorne waited near the landing zone with the expectant expression of someone whose career had just been salvaged by mission success, his earlier concerns about Blake's condition temporarily forgotten in the relief of achieving their operational objectives. Master Sergeant Reeves stood beside him, carrying documentation that would be required for after-action reports and intelligence dissemination. "Outstanding work," Thorne announced, as the mission team dismounted from the helicopter, his voice carrying genuine relief mixed with professional satisfaction. "Preliminary reports indicate target elimination was successful. We'll conduct full debriefing in 30 minutes. But as the team moved toward the command bunker, Torres found himself unable to maintain the fiction that Blake had made the impossible shot. The young corporal's sense of professional integrity wouldn't allow him to participate in a false narrative that gave credit where it wasn't due. "Sir," Torres said, his voice carrying uncertainty about how to proceed with information that would shatter everyone's understanding of the mission dynamics, "there's something you need to know about the shooting sequence." Thorne paused, noting something in Torres's tone that suggested complications he wasn't prepared to address. "Equipment problems? Environmental factors? We can address technical issues during the formal debriefing." "It wasn't equipment problems, sir." Torres looked directly at Kiara, seeking permission to reveal what he'd witnessed. "Sergeant Major Sullivan didn't make the shot." The statement hung in the desert air like an unexploded ordnance, its implications too dangerous to acknowledge but too significant to ignore. Thorne's expression cycled through confusion, disbelief, and the growing realization that his understanding of the mission was fundamentally incorrect. "What do you mean Sullivan didn't make the shot? Who else could have—" Thorne's voice trailed off as his eyes moved between the mission team members, processing possibilities that challenged everything he thought he knew about their capabilities. Blake stepped forward with the defeated posture of someone whose legendary reputation had just been publicly dismantled. "I couldn't do it," he said quietly, his voice carrying the finality of absolute confession. "My hands were shaking too badly to maintain sight picture. Psychological condition made accurate shooting impossible." The admission struck the assembled personnel like physical blows, each word dismantling assumptions that had defined their sense of security for 2 years. Blake Sullivan, the ghost, their legendary protector, was acknowledging complete incapacity at the moment when his skills had been most needed. "Then who made the shot?" Master Sergeant Reeves asked, his weathered face showing the professional concern of someone trying to solve a tactical puzzle that didn't fit normal parameters. Torres looked again at Kiara, who nodded slightly with the resignation of someone whose carefully maintained cover was about to be permanently destroyed. "Sergeant Delacroix made the shot, Master Sergeant. All 6,847 meters of it." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of helicopter rotors spinning down and the normal background noise of base operations. 47 soldiers were processing information that violated everything they thought they understood about military capabilities, unit assignments, and the invisible woman who'd been filing their paperwork for 9 months. Thorne stared at Kiara with the expression of someone's worldview was being reconstructed in real time. "That's impossible. Delacroix is communications support. She doesn't even qualify expert on standard rifle marksmanship."
"Actually," Kiara said quietly, her voice carrying a note of authority that made everyone present understand that fundamental truths were about to be revealed, "I do qualify expert on several weapon systems, including precision rifles designed for extreme range engagement." Captain Thorne's face went pale as implications began cascading through his mind. The woman he'd dismissed as support staff, the invisible specialist he'd barely acknowledged during 9 months of shared operations, had just accomplished something that challenged the theoretical limits of military marksmanship. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Kiara straightened to full attention with movements that suddenly seemed more military than anything Thorne had observed during her entire assignment at Combat Outpost Viper. "Master Sergeant Kiara Delacroix, Marine Corps Scout Sniper, call sign Phoenix,
Longest confirmed kill prior to today, 2,847 meters. Specialized training in extreme range precision shooting under adverse conditions. The revelation hit like successive artillery strikes, each detail more devastating than the last. Master Sergeant rank instead of Staff Sergeant, Marine Corps Scout Sniper rather than Communications Specialist, call sign Phoenix, a designation that carried legendary status in military sniper communities. Reeves stepped forward with the expression of someone whose professional knowledge was being challenged by impossible facts. Phoenix? I've heard that call sign. Fallujah Operations 2021, urban precision work that became classified legend. That was a different person, Kiara replied, but her voice lacked conviction. Someone who doesn't exist officially anymore. She exists, Blake interjected with sudden certainty. She just saved 47 lives and eliminated a high-value target that I couldn't engage. Phoenix exists, and she's been hiding among us for 9 months. Thorne's mind was racing through implications that extended far beyond mission success. His treatment of Kiara during her assignment, his dismissive comments about support staff, his complete failure to recognize exceptional capabilities, all of it was being reevaluated in light of information that made his leadership appear incompetent at best. Why? He asked, his voice carrying a mixture of professional curiosity and personal embarrassment. Why hide abilities like that? Why accept assignment as communication support when you're qualified for operational roles? Kiara was quiet for a moment, processing 3 years of carefully maintained anonymity that had just been permanently destroyed by necessity and mission requirements. Because sometimes people need to disappear from operational status for reasons that go beyond military regulations. Sometimes legendary abilities become psychological burdens that require different types of service. The explanation carried undertones of personal trauma and professional complexity that made everyone present understand that they were dealing with circumstances that extended far beyond normal military personnel assignments. Phoenix hadn't been hiding from enemy forces. She'd been hiding from expectations, reputation, and psychological pressures that had once threatened to destroy her, just as they had destroyed Blake Sullivan. Torres, still processing what he'd witnessed during the mission, found his voice again. The shot was perfect, sir. Mathematical precision at 6,847 meters with environmental compensation that exceeded anything I learned in sniper school. I've never seen anything like it. The professional assessment from someone who'd observed the shooting sequence firsthand carried weight that transcended rank and preconceived notions. Torres had witnessed precision that challenged normal understanding of human capabilities, demonstrated by someone whose official assignment suggested competence rather than excellence. As word of the mission's true details began spreading through Combat Outpost Viper's personnel, Kiara found herself at the center of attention she'd spent 9 months avoiding. Soldiers who'd barely acknowledged her existence were now staring with mixtures of awe, disbelief, and professional respect that made her carefully maintained invisibility impossible to sustain. The revelation that their communications specialist was actually Master Sergeant Phoenix, legendary sniper whose abilities exceeded even Blake Sullivan's famous reputation, was reshaping everyone's understanding of capability, recognition, and the danger of making assumptions about people based on their assigned roles rather than their actual qualifications. But more than professional embarrassment or tactical implications, the truth about Phoenix carried a deeper message about the warriors who serve in shadows, whose greatest achievements often require the kind of anonymity that makes recognition impossible until crisis forces revelation. Captain Thorne stood in the desert evening, processing the reality that he'd spent 9 months treating one of the military's most exceptional operators as invisible support staff, while Master Sergeant Phoenix prepared for the consequences of a secret that could no longer be maintained.
6 months after the Al-Harazi operation, Combat Outpost Viper had transformed from a forgotten forward position into a model installation for integrated special operations. The changes weren't immediately visible to casual observers. The same concrete barriers, razor wire, and desert camouflage that had defined the base for years remained in place. But the personnel dynamics, operational procedures, and command philosophy had evolved in ways that reflected hard-learned lessons about capability, recognition, and the danger of assumptions. Master Sergeant Kiara Delacroix stood at the newly constructed precision marksmanship range, observing a training exercise that would have been impossible under the previous command structure. The range extended to 2,000 meters across the desert valley, equipped with advanced ballistic computers, environmental monitoring stations, and target systems that challenged even experienced marksmen. But more significant than the equipment was the training philosophy that now emphasized developing hidden potential rather than simply utilizing recognized talent. Blake Sullivan approached the firing line with movements that carried quiet confidence rather than the desperate tension that had characterized his final months as primary sniper. 6 months of intensive therapy, gradual exposure to shooting stress, and a new role as senior marksmanship instructor had allowed him to rebuild his relationship with precision shooting on terms that acknowledged both his limitations and his continuing value as a teacher. "Today's environmental conditions are perfect for long-range work," he announced to the assembled students, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned to find purpose beyond personal performance. "Temperature gradient is minimal, wind patterns are consistent, and visibility is excellent. Perfect opportunity to push your maximum effective ranges." The students included personnel from across Combat Outpost Viper's command structure: infantry soldiers seeking to expand their capabilities, support staff whose hidden talents had been identified through new assessment protocols, and visiting operators from other units who'd requested training from the legendary Phoenix. The diversity reflected a fundamental shift in how the military approached talent development and capability recognition. Among the students was Captain Lucas Garrett, Blake's replacement as base commander after Captain Thorne's reassignment to staff duties at division headquarters. Garrett's promotion had come with specific instructions to implement new personnel assessment protocols that prevented exceptional capabilities from being overlooked due to conventional role assignments. The key to extreme range shooting isn't just technical skill, it's understanding that environmental factors become as important as marksmanship fundamentals. At distances beyond 1,000 meters, you're not just shooting, you're applying physics. Corporal Torres, now a staff sergeant and the base's senior intelligence analyst, had become one of Blake's most dedicated students. His experience as Kiara's spotter during the Al-Harazi mission had given him unique insights into extreme range ballistics, and his natural analytical abilities made him an exceptional candidate for precision shooting training. "Sergeant Major Sullivan, how do you calculate compensation for thermal effects when you can't directly measure temperature variations along the bullet's flight path?" The question demonstrated the sophisticated understanding that had developed among Combat Outpost Viper's personnel since Kiara's revelation. Discussions of ballistic mathematics, environmental compensation, and precision shooting theory had become routine rather than exotic, reflecting an institutional commitment to developing capabilities rather than simply identifying them. Blake smiled as he prepared to answer, his response reflecting months of therapeutic work that had allowed him to find value in teaching rather than performing. That's where experience and intuition complement mathematical calculations. Master Sergeant Delacroix, would you care to explain the practical applications?
Kiara stepped forward with the quiet confidence that had replaced her carefully maintained invisibility, moving among the students with the natural authority of someone whose expertise was now recognized and utilized rather than hidden. 6 months of official operational status had allowed her to develop training programs that pushed the boundaries of conventional marksmanship while maintaining the psychological safety that prevented breakdown. Thermal effects create vertical deflection that varies with atmospheric conditions, she explained, gesturing toward the desert valley where heat shimmer created visible distortion. The key is learning to read environmental indicators that suggest temperature gradients, wind patterns, mirage characteristics, even the way distant objects appear through optics. The instruction continued with technical details that would have been incomprehensible to most military personnel 6 months earlier, but were now standard curriculum at Combat Outpost Viper. The transformation reflected institutional learning that extended far beyond individual capability development. It represented a fundamental shift in how the military approached talent recognition and operational effectiveness. During the afternoon break, First Sergeant Marcus Rivera approached Kiara with the expression of someone carrying important information. Rivera had been assigned to Combat Outpost Viper specifically to implement new personnel assessment protocols that prevented exceptional capabilities from being overlooked due to administrative assignments or personal choice to remain anonymous. Master Sergeant, Rivera said, consulting a folder marked with classification stamps, I've received communication from Joint Special Operations Command. They're requesting your input on developing selection criteria for extreme-range precision programs. The request represented institutional recognition that Phoenix's abilities weren't just individual excellence, but potential templates for developing similar capabilities in other operators. 6 months after her forced revelation, Kiara had become not just an operational asset, but a strategic resource whose experience could influence military training doctrine. They want to codify what you do, turn individual excellence into teachable methodology, your ballistic calculations, environmental assessment techniques, psychological preparation methods, all of it could become standard curriculum for advanced marksmanship programs. Kiara considered the implications carefully, understanding that such institutional adoption would prevent her from ever returning to anonymity while potentially saving lives through improved training. What about operators who need to step back from operational status? Will the new programs account for psychological factors that might require different types of service? The question reflected lessons learned not just from her own experience, but from witnessing Blake's breakdown and recovery. Exceptional capabilities carried psychological burdens that required institutional support rather than simply performance expectations. That's specifically addressed in the proposed protocols, Rivera assured her. Flexible assignment options, therapeutic support for performance anxiety, alternative service paths that maintain operator dignity while acknowledging human limitations. Your situation and Sergeant Major Sullivan's have become case studies for managing exceptional talent over entire careers rather than just peak performance periods. As the afternoon training session resumed, Kiara observed students attempting shots that would have been considered impossible under previous training doctrine. Not all succeeded. Extreme range precision remained challenging regardless of instruction quality. But the environment encouraged experimentation and growth rather than simply recognizing predetermined excellence.
Private Sarah Chen, a communications specialist whose analytical abilities had been identified through new assessment protocols, achieved her first successful hit at 1,200 meters using principles that Phoenix had developed specifically for students without extensive shooting backgrounds. The success represented validation of training methodologies that could develop exceptional capabilities rather than simply identifying them. "Outstanding shot, Chen," Kiara called out, noting how the private's technique incorporated environmental assessment skills that had taken years to master through independent development. "Your wind reading was perfect for those conditions." The interaction represented a fundamental shift from hierarchical performance recognition to collaborative capability development, reflecting institutional changes that had emerged from lessons learned during the Al-Harazi operation. As evening approached and training concluded, Blake approached Kiara with the expression of someone whose relationship with his profession had been fundamentally reconstructed through therapeutic work and new purpose. "6 months ago, I thought my career was over because I couldn't perform at levels that had defined my identity. Now I understand that exceptional service takes many forms." The observation carried weight that extended beyond individual recovery to institutional wisdom about managing exceptional talent throughout military careers. Blake's transition from legendary performer to exceptional instructor represented a model for maintaining operational value while acknowledging human limitations. "Some warriors hide because they need to heal," Kiara replied.
watching desert shadows lengthen across the range where tomorrow would bring new students seeking to develop capabilities they didn't know they possessed. Others hide because institutions don't recognize excellence in unexpected forms. The key is creating environments where both can serve according to their abilities and circumstances. As the sun set over Combat Outpost Viper, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and crimson, the base settled into evening routine with the quiet efficiency of a command that had learned to recognize capability in all its forms. Somewhere among the support staff, supply personnel, and administrative specialists, exceptional abilities waited to be discovered and developed rather than overlooked. The lesson of Master Sergeant Phoenix wasn't just about hidden talent. It was about institutional wisdom that recognized potential in everyone, provided pathways for development, and acknowledged that exceptional service could take many forms depending on circumstances, capability, and choice. Warriors don't always carry rifles or make impossible shots. Sometimes they teach, support, coordinate, and serve in ways that enable others to achieve excellence. The most extraordinary people often hide in the most ordinary places, waiting for institutions wise enough to look beyond assignments and recognize the potential that exists when circumstances, capability, and opportunity align. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.